Welcome to this very informal chat, and just to thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm Stephen Smith, I'm the Dean of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, and before we start I'd like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who've been custodians of these lands for many generations. The land on which we meet today was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and we are grateful that local Aboriginal peoples continue to have a unique role in the life of this university. It gives me very great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Sir Paul Nurse. He is here on an official visit, inverted commas, to give the annual Graham Clark oration. He has a formidable reputation, but as I hope you'll find out, he's a really decent bloke. So he is, of course, a Nobel laureate. He's president of the Royal Society. He's president of the British Science Association, and he's director of the Francis Crick Institute, the new institute in London, and was past president of the Rockefeller University. His research, for those of you who are maybe not in the biomedical space, is in cell cycle regulation and a million other things, but broadly in that area. And it's a great pleasure that Sir Paul has agreed to chat with us this evening, to be perfectly honest. So just to get the thing rolling, I was going to ask Sir Paul to just give a few words about the sorts of issues in science which you're going to be facing for your career. Paul, thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and hello, everybody. Hello. I first of all want to know, what do the numbers mean on there?
I'm not sure. I think we count them all in. And
so I could say 35 or 32 if somebody asks a question. I've never seen numbers in a lecture theatre before. It's probably to see whether you actually turn up for lectures, I suspect. But anyway, we'll see. I'll just say a couple of words about myself and then about the challenges for you. Stephen's already introduced me. I am a research scientist, I still am, but I've also run things. Cancer Research UK in the UK, Rockefeller University in New York, and at the moment I'm President of the Royal Society and Director of the Francis Crick Institute. So this does mean that, as well as science, I've been involved in quite a lot of scientific management, political work, media and things like that. So if you wanted to ask any questions in essentially anything like that, I'm very happy to deal with it. Okay. Challenges for young scientists today. Well, it's really one thing, to be good enough. Really, to be good enough. And to be good enough, you have to combine a number of qualities, and the main one is passion for what you're wanting to do. Frankly, that gets you through the rough spots, because there's quite a lot of rough spots in science. So passion is absolutely crucial. It helps to be intelligent, you know, it helps to be intelligent. It helps to work hard, and it helps to have imagination and to think about doing things that the entire world is not thinking about. Because there is always a problem when we go around as scientists in herds following whatever is particularly trendy at this moment, because usually by the time it's trendy, it's on its way out, actually. So these are things that we might touch upon, but primarily passion. That's the real thing. A desire to want to know the answer. That's absolutely crucial. Now, I think we're going to have a lot of questions. I should say one thing. I suffer from tinnitus. That means I've got noises in the head. I keep waiting for them to turn into voices, but that hasn't yet happened. And if I answer a question which isn't the one that you asked, don't feel fazed about it. Just ask the original question again, and there's a chance I'll get it right the second time. So with that introduction, over to you.
Okay, who wants to fire away? I've got, we asked you some questions before. Daniela Ingle.
Wave,
yeah,
okay.
Daniela, where you go?
And can you shout then?
I'm trying to remember what I wrote. I think my question was, given, basically, where do you see science and the scientific community going in the next 20 years? What will be the main challenges, in particular, given how it's so focused on funding and publishing at the moment as the main metrics for how successful you are, and also bridging the gap into science increasingly more related to policy development
Yeah.
I think I remember it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, well done. You remember it.
Good.
So you're 236, so hello 236. Yeah. The first thing I want to say is that quite often young researchers think that the issues of the day are brand new. Whereas actually, in my experience, the sorts of issues that you just described, where what will happen, careers, funding, how do we deal with policy, and how do we deal with the pressure for society to look, quite understandably, for something back, for applications and so on, are issues that have faced actually researchers all my research life. So don't think that this is all completely new. It is something that we've had around. It goes up and down in terms of the severity of the issues, but they have always been around. Now, having said that, do I think the major challenges that we'll see in the research environment? I think this does vary from country to country, but the first major challenge is that we have to convince society and the politicians elected by society that science and scientific research is a good thing. And that is absolutely crucial, because we are an expensive activity. And society has to feel that it's getting something back from what's invested. And so we have to convince our political leaders, and the way we do that is through convincing the public and society that in fact science is a good thing for the public good. And by the public good, I think of an umbrella of economic growth, which politicians are very interested in, but also the quality of life, improvement of health, protecting the environment, maintaining a sustainable economic growth are all very important issues. You know, where is energy going to come from? What are we going to do about global health? What are we going to do about global warming? All of these issues have a major and significant scientific element. And it is not so difficult to persuade society and politicians that these are very important issues to take on, which science has a great deal to contribute. But we have to work at it. We can't just sit in our ivory tower and just hold out our hands and expect money for research to drop into our hands. We've got to work at that. And that means getting out there, engaging the public, getting on the media when necessary, if you're any good at it. And that's important, by the way. Most people aren't really good at it. And what we want, when we have people who are, you should cherish them. Don't mock them, cherish them. And get out and engage the public. So that's the first thing. The second challenge is to persuade those that support research that this is quite a complicated landscape. Sometimes, and I've seen it in a number of countries that I've visited, that there's this rather simple-minded view that if science is going to address a particular problem, then where you should put the research is immediately around those immediate applications. Now, there's no question that we should have support around those immediate applications, but they will, on the whole, be only leading to incremental increases in how that problem can be tackled. If you want to have fundamental change in how issues can be dealt with, then you have to go to discovery research. That is, discovering things that weren't known before and where you don't exactly know where they will go with respect to the public good. And to get the best discovery research, you have to recognize that that is best done by motivating individuals, individual scientists, and motivating them to follow their own curiosity. So we have this curious spectrum of research activity. Research which is close to application, which can be directed, or at least part of the time, through translation back to discovery research, which doesn't profit from being closely directed. Now, once again, society and political leaders understand this if we, that is scientific leaders, are not lazy in the way that we explain it. If we simply go for what is seen to be the cheap option, of just going for application, then that's just lazy, and we just have to explain it and they will get it. So that's the second thing. Now, you may have asked the question with a less interest in these bigger issues and more about you or your colleagues more specifically. I mean, what is the challenge for you? And if you did, I'll just comment on that just a little bit. And the challenge for you is to decide whether you want to do this activity, because it is quite hard. You're probably never going to get paid a great deal. And you've got to keep going through, often, if you're at the cutting edge of science, through failures. In my lab, we fail a lot of the time. Certainly well over 50%, maybe 80%. And you have to be able to deal with those sorts of issues. Now, you touched upon publication. We always have to publish. You know, science isn't something you just do for your own idle curiosity. It is to build the infrastructure of science. And to do that, you have to publish. The focus here is not to say, well, you know, I'm pressurized to publish all the time, because the numbers of papers you publish is frankly not important. What matters is the quality of what you do. And you have to focus on high quality production. My graduate students publish 1 paper during their period, maybe 2. I mean, we don't seek to publish 5 or 10 or whatever, because then you often just produce trivial publications. And that does require, of course, a scientific society that recognizes quality and not quantity. And that really is the job of people like Stephen and myself to ensure that that happens. Is there anything I missed out that you would like me to cover?
No, you do a fantastic job, thanks.
I like you, 235.
We'll note it down too. More questions? Yeah, 92.
In a brief scan online before I came here, I noticed that you've made comments before about, particularly in the US, calling up people on trying to obfuscate the teaching of science in schools, particularly with regard to Republicans and evolution. I'm wondering, when and how should scientists go about telling policymakers and telling politicians and other people in positions of power that what they're doing is incorrect or the wrong way to go around it? And how do we do that without destroying the idea of scientists being impartial and objective?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is it is important to engage. And when issues come up, you mentioned the attack on teaching evolution in some states in the US, for example. I mean, we could comment on other toxic issues like climate change in, of course, Australia with the present political leadership. I mean, oh no, you told me not to be political, didn't you? Yeah. And then the issues around stem cells and so on. And actually, the contentious issues are often limited to only about half a dozen things that constantly get recycled. So you have to engage. Now, my first sort of rules with this is we need to engage, and you need most of the time to engage politely. Okay? It's no good just ranting like they rant or can rant. You should always try and engage politely. And my general approach here has been to try and correct, or at least indicate that with respect to the scientific issues involved, what they should be thinking about. And usually all I say, because although I get asked my opinions about this because I'm President of the Royal Society, so it's a UK National Academy of Science, the reality is that I'm not expert on most of the things they want to know about. I mean, what do I know specifically about climate change and all sorts of other things? So all I usually say is listen to the scientific experts, okay? Though that's enough to enrage. That is often enough to enrage. Having said that you should be polite and courteous and try to explain it, I do lose my patience when individuals who have the ear of the media, columnists, for example, who can write whatever they like one week because they can write something else the next week, doesn't really matter, or politicians with axes to grind, who mix up science with politics, with ideology, and with religion. Now, that I lose my patience with when you have serial offenders at doing that, because my view is this, that scientists cannot make public policy. That is the job of society. But what we can do is provide the scientific base for which should inform policy. Now, it could be that politicians, for particular reasons, decide to ignore the science. Let's take something on use of drugs, recreational drugs. Now, we know that there's a range of different drugs out there, and we know that traditionally certain drugs are more acceptable to society, like tobacco, like alcohol, which are probably more dangerous to the individual than other drugs which are in fact not acceptable. And so we get into this slightly sort of bizarre situation where if you were to take a scientific assessment of the different dangers associated with the different drug usage, then you would come up with let's say, a league table of dangers which probably does not coincide to society's league table of dangers, because tobacco is so accepted, because alcohol is so accepted. Now, faced with that situation, a politician may decide that he doesn't want to ban tobacco or to insist that you have a prescription before you can take tobacco, if I can take an extreme position, even though, I mean, it causes premature death. But at least what they should say is, look, we know tobacco is extremely dangerous. We know the scientific evidence for that means it's more dangerous than some other drug. However, we know what is acceptable for society, and just be honest about it, okay? I could accept that. What I hate is when the politician or the columnist tries to manipulate the science to support a position that they have, which is actually being taken on other grounds. And for the case of climate change in this country, it may be that the political position is based upon mining interests, for example. Now, that's a legitimate argument, but then what should happen is that should be argued as the reason why the issues around dealing with climate change are being weakened in Australia, not because by rubbishing the science, because the science is sound. So what I'm trying to say there is that we do have to accept, we give scientific advice, the politicians may not respond to it, the columnists may not respond to it, but at least what I ask for them to be is to be honest, okay? And of course that they don't want to be. Now, what else can I say about this? If they are serial offenders, then I get more vicious with them, okay? So there is a limit to my politeness, and after a while I will go for them. And of course, they don't like that.
So just to slightly clarify, in situations like that, like the climate change or recreational drugs, as you've discussed, when politicians know that there's little political capital to be gained from supporting something like that and a lot to be lost, do you think that scientists have any other recourse except for occasionally making comments if you're an eminent scientist, or educating the public more in science in general? Are those the only two options left, or is there anything else that can
I think they are really the only two options that are left. I mean, I don't want to push scientists into the position where we have a special position in policy making. Wouldn't be comfortable with that. I think we have to take the long-term view, and we have to chip away at it, and it takes time. An issue I haven't brought up is, for example, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, where the debate in the 1990s went completely badly, and only now, back in the UK, which I'm more familiar with, can we return to it. And over the years, gradually public opinion has gradually changed due to concerted action and by academics mostly rather than companies, and it just takes time. I don't think we can do anything else, so it's slow. In the end, though, science will prevail. I'm sure of that, at least in good democratic societies with a good democratic process. The science will eventually prevail. The only problem is many of us will be dead first. Yes. Hello, wave, yeah.
I'm 81.
You're 81. Hello, 81. Yeah.
So last year you spoke out against the vote for Scottish independence, and I was wondering if you could...
Don't think it was on top of Sir Paul's list of what he might have to discuss. But
Okay, you're not from Scottish origins, are you?
Yes.
Yes. I was looking for the tartan, but I hadn't seen it. Yeah.
No, I just wondered how you...
Why did I speak out on
and
it?
how do you decide what are the things that require your voice? How do you select your targets for advocacy and you know, that sort of thing?
Well, I was a very minor voice in the Scottish independence debate. I was emotionally and sentimentally involved because I had worked in Scotland for 7 years in Edinburgh. So unlike most of my English colleagues, I had first-hand knowledge and loved Scotland, okay? And I spoke about it, however, entirely in a research perspective. And I wanted... Now, that isn't quite true, actually. I should backtrack. I was concerned about the debate going on in Scotland because the SNP, who were the major party arguing for independence, were not encouraging an open and free debate. What happened was this, is that if you came south of the border, then you were bullying them, right? If you were from north of the border, that is in Scotland, they bullied you, okay? I mean, which is how it worked. So, for example, when a university vice-chancellor in Scotland said this could damage our education system and damage our research system, then an SNP minister phoned them up and said, if you say that again, we'll make sure that whatever happens, we'll be looking at your funding, okay? And I mean, this is utterly, utterly outrageous, and that made me cross. So what they were trying to do was use political means to silence debate. So I went to Scotland partly for that, to open up debate, but I spoke only about the research agenda, and that was straightforward. Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland work as a unit research-wise. We have, for most activities, not actually for healthcare delivery, where there's research associated, but for most activities, single research councils, which means that the critical mass is sufficient for you actually to have real debates about setting priorities and so on that matter. Small countries on the whole, find it more difficult to be that open. So a country such as Scotland, if it was independent with a population of 5 million, which would have been about half of London, just to put it in perspective, and distributed over a large landmass, would have found it difficult to actually cover all the bases that a healthy and thriving scientific culture requires. Also, inevitably, although we would have worked hard at reducing the barriers, as soon as you put a barrier in place, it doesn't encourage the free flow of people and therefore ideas. Now, that is something we could tackle. We have to tackle it with the rest of Europe, of course, but it for me, was no advantage for the research endeavour. So that was the reason I spoke out. But nobody took any notice of me, so, you know.
Yeah, back first.
Paul,
Hi.
Hi, I'm 201.
You're 201.
You mentioned before that you're currently overseeing some graduate students. You're on several societies. Do you have any projects that you're individually or, well, personally involved with research at the moment, or is it more of an overseeing role?
You mean me individually in my own research, or is it all teamwork that I'm involved in? Is that your question?
I guess, are you directly involved, or is it more of an overseeing role these days?
Yeah. I'm a little unusual in the sense that I both have sort of leadership role and also a coal-face role. Because I still run a research group, I still have graduate students who I directly supervise, I still have postdoctoral workers I directly supervise. My group isn't huge, but it's not small either. I have 4 PhD students and 3 postdocs at the moment, a couple of technicians, so a group of about 10 individuals. But I supervise all of them individually myself. I don't have a lieutenant there and I call in once or twice every week. I'm actually speaking with them usually every day or two, either visiting or by video conferencing. So I'm very active, actually. it is a bit of a strain, to be quite honest, because I do have to do a lot of work, and I don't give them as much attention as I would like. On the other hand, when I do, they sometimes suggest maybe I could just go away and do something for the nation instead. So, you know, there is a limit to how much they want to see me sort of poking around in their notebooks, I think, you know. Do you know, it's still the most important thing for me, and if I had to make the choice, you know, if they said you can be president of the Royal Society, but you can't carry on your research, I would have not taken it. That isn't the issue, but sometimes running, you know, I ran Cancer Research UK and so on, some people said, well, you'll have to give up your research. And I said, well, then don't bother to ask me to do the job. Usually they give in.
Yes, hang on, there's one next, and then two others. Yep.
I had a question about the way that science is taught to children in schools, trying to get people more interested in science.
Yeah.
And we have sort of more scientifically literate global community. Do you see any ways, problems in the way that science is taught to children in schools, or do you see any ways that that could be improved to sort of increase the general scientific literacy?
Well, firstly, I'm no expert on school education. I do find that as scientists get older, they suddenly start pontificating about education in schools. I think they discover, yes, you know what, they discover they've got grandchildren who are in school, and they've not themselves entered a school for 50 years, and suddenly they start telling everybody how to do it. And I do try to avoid falling into that trap. But I will give you my own views for what they are worth, but they should be taken with a pinch of salt, okay? I do think we could do better at school, and I'm going to make several comments about it. I think the first thing is, once again, just honesty. Science is quite a difficult subject, and I think it's worthwhile just remembering that teaching science is not the easiest of subjects, and whereas some subjects you can have, if you like, a shallow learning curve, with science it can be quite steep, and I think we have to take that on board, you know. So why I say that is we can't just be glib about it, as if, you know, if we just worked a bit harder it would work. I actually think it's difficult to teach science well. So there is a problem, and I think it's difficult to do well. It isn't helped by the fact that quite often science is taught in schools by teachers who have got limited experience of the science that they're teaching. If you are in the UK and I don't know what the stats are for Australia, I apologise for that, but if you're in a primary school, that's the age between 5 and 11 years of age, I think it's only 1 or maybe 2% of any teachers there will have any science at all beyond essentially elementary scientific teaching. And you might say, well, that's primary school and perhaps, you know, that doesn't matter, but I think it does matter, because we have to capture school kids with science early on, and they are so naturally curious at that age that they will absorb it. And what happens if you have a teacher who isn't experienced with science, who doesn't feel comfortable with it? It comes over immediately in the teaching, because they're insecure and they're immediately defensive. You know, I don't blame them for it. I'm not criticising. It's just where in fact they come from. So primary schools are an issue. What do we do about it? I actually think, and this is my own invention of policy, and it may be stupid, but I think that we should probably think about grouping primary schools together. I mean, so if we've got 6 or 8 primary schools in an area, and then having one of them a laboratory or teaching class, because most primary schools don't have laboratories, and at least one teacher who is on top of it, okay? And so that we can use that as a sort of place for driving teaching. I'm setting up a new institute, the Francis Crick Institute in London. Some of you may know about it or may want to ask about it. And I'm putting in it a teaching lab for school kids, and I will aim at primary school children for this very reason. And it's the only institute I know that is set up like that. And we will take the experiment to see how that works. So that's primary school. Let's move to secondary school. Now there the statistics are better. So there about 2/3 of UK teachers who teach science have got some experience in science. But what you will find is, for example, is that, that somebody who's been trained, say, to undergraduate level in biology is being asked to teach physics, okay? And that also is difficult because the different scientific disciplines do pull upon different experiences and qualities, and particularly physics, quite difficult, uses quite a lot of maths. My daughter is a research physicist, so I'm very familiar with the different skill sets that are required, does lead to the same discomfiture that I talked about in primary school, where somebody is teaching a subject which they don't feel confident about. And this leads to a spiral. If you're taught in an unconfident way by a teacher, then you don't engage, and then you don't have enough to... It's a vicious cycle downwards. So we do have to attract good teachers who are familiar with the subject. So that's something else that we need to think about. And by the way, just to touch upon that, since, and somebody may ask about research careers, since many graduate students will not end up in a job in research science, and that's something, again, that we haven't taken on the nose properly, then making science teaching an exciting alternative is something that we really should make attractive, that we should encourage, and so on. Final point I'd like to make, though, is in my view, quite a simple but crucial one. If science at school is taught like a collection of eternal facts, chiseled in granite like tombstones, then science will be conveyed as something which is static and chiseled like tombstones, okay? Whereas actually, it's very important at school for pupils to understand what science is and why science is such a reliable way of understanding the world. Now, let's take two areas of, I don't want to say study, astronomy and astrology, okay? Now, if you are taught simply facts, why should you believe astronomy over astrology? Okay? So if you're told by somebody that Newton's law of physics tells us how the planets go round, okay, then and you just believe it and you don't know upon what basis that it's based, then you could equally well believe that Capricorns are whatever they are, emotionally unstable or whatever, whatever it is. I don't read the horoscopes, but something like that. So what you've got to realise, and frankly, I mean, most school kids don't fully get this, is what underpins the scientific endeavour, which is you have an idea, you constantly test it, you challenge it, you test it in another way, you check whether it works. If it doesn't work, you reject it and you modify it. There's a whole process that you go through. And we have to communicate that process and go through those processes at school, and it requires a confident teacher to do that, to show where it's coming from. And that way we can distinguish astronomy from astrology, which is crucial. So I don't think we focus enough on the process of science, and I don't think we focus on showing that for some of the critical issues that lead to scientific understanding and scientific laws. So that would be my observations to it. And the final thing, sorry, we need inspirational teachers. We really need inspirational teachers. I had an inspirational teacher at school, and we need them. We really need them because we have to inspire our kids. Sorry.
Yeah, 52.
So Paul, in your discussion so far, we've touched a little bit on dissemination of science into the broader community, the attraction of having graduate students actually move into the teaching field. My question is more around how do we foster a culture amongst our science literate individuals at the younger age, that it's not just the pure science of things that is important for society, but it's actually to have scientifically minded individuals in all aspects of science. And how can we foster a culture outside of the ivory tower to paint to our graduate students who live in the lab all day that there is actually life beyond sitting at the bench?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will address it at several levels. Let's go back to school. We need to first of all recognise that scientific education at school is aimed at the population as a whole. There's only a small fraction who will be like you, who will end up being professionals in some, I assume you're looking to be professionals, in some aspect of science. We have to think in terms of education that you are educating the population to be comfortable with science and to be able to engage with science later in life. So that's where we actually should start. Now, here, I believe in the University of Melbourne, you have a sort of humanities, scientific, liberal arts type of 3 years, I think, at the beginning. Is that correct? And I think that is a much more productive ground for the sort of cultural change that you're talking about. The university system in the UK doesn't actually have that. They specialise straight on, and I think other universities here in Australia do that. But I do think the liberal arts approach, which is like the liberal art colleges in the United States, does mean that you get exposed to a wider range of subject areas, and if science is taught well, that's got to help as well. So I think that's a second point. Third point is to address something that I briefly touched upon. We train the engine room of research, of researchers, are younger researchers, usually studying for a graduate degree, master's or a PhD, sometimes for a period of time, postdoctoral workers after that. Now, our career structure is such that, as I said already, many of those will not have a research career. And we, as a research profession, have firstly not recognised that well enough, and secondly, we have not, in my view, addressed the fact that if you decide as a PhD student you don't want to be a researcher, we tend to look upon that as perhaps as a failure, because most supervisors have only known what they did, okay? What we need to do, and I again will introduce this at the Francis Crick Institute, is to have a graduate program where it is seen that when you've finished your graduate studies, that something else may be acceptable, and we have to actually promote those things that you could do. And that way we, if you like, export scientific expertise into the rest of society at quite a high level. And I think that's something that we really need to work upon, because I don't quite know what the figures are, but probably 70–80% will be in that category. And we need to encourage that, actually, rather than discourage it. Now, the final thing about the cultural side is, of course, the media, because once you've left school, the main way you'll get exposed to science is through the media. And we need to work, if we want to have the good culture you're referring to, we need to work on the way in which the media deals with science, the way it communicates the science. And that's a difficult one, because the most influential media is television, but television is seen as entertainment, and so there is this great pressure, and I've done a number of TV shows, there's great pressure to make the science so entertaining that you lose the content of the science. You know? So a typical program, even from the BBC, who do, on the whole, a very, very good job here, but they'll do something like, they will take on the Higgs boson, right? Now, the Higgs boson is more or less incomprehensible to any normal individual, of course. So what they will do, they will sort of waffle on a bit about it and sort of, you know, talk about some particle that gives mass, you know, and you're sort of playing around a bit with it in your head as to what it might mean. And then it will go into a completely and utterly incomprehensible black box of sort of, you know, CERN with lots of wires coming out of it, okay, and you'll be, the camera will go up and down sort of large magnets or something. And then out the other side will become Mr. Higgs, Peter Higgs, who will be interviewed, and his idea has been vindicated, okay? And it's a sort of entertainment, because you know, you've got an idea, you've got a lot of expensive kit, and then you've got an ancient, venerable, highly intelligent person. But have you communicated anything? I suspect not. We do a bit better in some areas. Biology on the whole is a little bit better, except always they're trying to sell it on, you know, on the basis, well, we're going to cure cancer next week, you know, which is the other problem, you know, that I personally had to face sometimes. So getting even great media organisations like BBC to get to grips with this is difficult. Now there are, with the new digital age, there are ways in which you can do this. You know, you don't have to have mass audiences. We have a program called Horizon, and they want 1.5 million to 2 million viewers. But if they were content with 250,000, then they can change the way, and 250,000 is important. So having digital approaches would allow you to segment the offerings, which is the sort of language they use, segment the offerings so that you can actually target for those who are in a more intermediate level. Newspapers, once again, often you have good newspaper scientists, I mean, who write. Then, you know, it's destroyed by some rotten headline or whatever. But some of the good broadsheets are okay. I'm not so familiar with Australia, but I sense it isn't handled quite so well. I mean, I'm not sure that Murdoch TV does so brilliant in this direction, but I'm not sure about that, but I'm not sure it is. And I think that probably it could do with some attention.
Yes, another question. Yeah.
I was recently at a bioinformatics conference at Monash, and there was this topic about connections between academia and industry and how, compared to the rest of the world, Australia isn't doing that well, I guess, or what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
So the question, I think, is connections between academia and commerce industry, and what do I think in bioinformatics, and what do I think about Australia in particular?
I guess, how do you recognize?
What were they saying? They didn't think Australia was doing well?
Yeah, we're not doing that well, I guess. Yeah.
It's true to say that most countries think they don't do very well, actually, but I'll come to that in a moment. You touched upon bioinformatics, but actually the question you're asking is generalizable. And the general point is that quite often we are doing discovery research pretty well. And we discover things, and Australia's pretty strong. I have to say the UK is pretty strong too, actually, very strong. And the US is the strongest, but probably only because it's the biggest and has got the most finance. Yet trying to turn that into those discoveries, to translate it into something that is useful, either commercially or for the public good more generally, is harder. And of course, it is harder because you've got to understand something, and then you've got to learn how you can actually manipulate it. So with the stem cell research we talked about, we understand some things about stem cells, but actually get that into a process that can be safely and reliably used, that you can pass all the regulatory barriers, is extremely tough. It's yet more and more fine cooking, but it's extremely tough. Now, what do I think about this translational thing and commercialization? Well, a couple of things. I addressed it, I think, with 237, or was it 236 up there a little bit. I think that that discovery research, you cannot tell where it's going to go, and you can't easily think of ways in which, if you say, I want to solve this problem, this applied problem, and you're discovering something over here, that's tricky, okay? And actually, it's really difficult, and I'm going to explain why. Can you see this? Can everybody see here? Let us say this is your applied objective, right? That tumbler over there. And let's say this is you make a discovery like this, okay? And it's going in that direction. So typically, if you're being pressurized to make something useful and translatable, or your university wants to make money out of you, which is the sort of pressure you get, then they would say, right, let's set up a company or something to get to here, okay? Now, the scientific process is a bit different. You get to here, and then you think, right, I'm now going to test an experiment to see whether we can go from here to here, okay? But what will then happen is that, okay? You'll get an outcome, and it pushes you over here. okay? Then what might happen, excuse me, is you do another experiment and you come out here. Now, if you are a discovery researcher, you don't care. You go where you're taken by nature, by the scientific observation, by the scientific experiment. Now, you may well end up at another commercial goal that is over there, okay? But if you are being funded by a company to go there, right, then if an experiment takes you in this direction, you start switching off your way of thinking, your skepticism, because you don't want to go over there, you want to go over there. Whereas as a discovery scientist, you don't actually care where you go. This sounds trivial, but it's utterly important. Because if you are driving in translation from the very beginning of discovery, nearly always it won't work the way you want, and nearly always a lot of money is wasted. Now, what do you do about it? Well, this device here of using your curiosity and testing is the best way to get discovery knowledge. But what you then have to do is you promote this, and then you capture whatever you can for translation, wherever it may be. So it means that you only actually contemplate translation for an applied purpose if you're much closer to the objective. I mean, this is something that a 5-year-old can understand, yet I can tell you billions have been wasted in this sort of way. I mean, it's just amazing how much. But if you are much closer to application, you have different rules about which you operate than if you're a long way away. So the commercialization requires you to think in a different sort of way about this. When you're close to application, it's straightforward. If you're not, then you have to be very open as to what you do. So with the institute I'm setting up, I'll repeat the language I think I already said. We're a discovery institute, very open to translation wherever it may go. So this Discovery Institute doesn't work on cancer or infectious disease or degenerate disease. It will work in principle on all of that, because it will make discoveries that could be relevant in any of these areas. Once we have a discovery, then we can work and collaborate with others that would actually exploit it. And I think all of this is relevant, I think, to your question, though I've gone a bit off. Are you okay with that?
I think to put that in the Australian context, Paul, the Americans actually have a whole complicated system which allows them to take the research further along that path in a non-directed way. And although they're always portrayed as the great harbingers of hard-nosed capitalism, in reality they have mechanisms to take research further along the path. Now, I'm not making any political comment about the situation in Australia, but there is a big argument at the moment about trying to push that too far this way, because it'll fail for exactly those reasons. Did you have a...
Yes, you had a follow-up. Maybe I didn't ask them.
Kind of different questions. It's kind of
you can have one last question and then we must close up.
Well, in terms of... There was also the topic about like relationships between maths and biology.
Maths and biology, yeah.
And how like most in like particular like when you start off in high school or like primary education, like they're seen as parallel worlds.
Yeah.
But like if you want to continue into the future, like especially bioinformatics, there are a lot of overlaps that have to be made, and people have to realize like when you're doing biology, you can't just switch off from mathematics. It's there, and it's a tool that's there to be.
Okay, so you've introduced the topic of quantitative analysis and systems biology. And of course, biological organisms are systems, complex systems, and always have been. When I was an undergraduate, which was just before the molecular biology revolution, we talked a great deal about systems biology. I have a whole stack of books written in the 50s and 60s which were about it. It then was submerged by the detail of molecular biology. It's now come back again as we look at more and more molecules. We do need to be aware of what mathematics can bring. We do need to collaborate across the boundaries of science, which doesn't mean you, as a biologist, if you are a biologist, have to be an expert in mathematics, but you have to be able to talk to a mathematician. You have to have a sufficient commonality in language that you really can communicate in a sufficient level that you can actually work together. Now, I'm myself didn't take mathematics beyond 15 years age at school, but I happen to be okay mathematically and can talk to modelers and so on very, very easily. So you don't have to be that well trained. You just have to put some sort of effort into it. Talking about collaborations in the multidisciplinary space, which is something I've thought a great deal about, particularly with biological laboratory scientists like me and a clinical scientist like Stephen here, is that we need to recognize that actually we're brought up in different sorts of ways. There's cultural differences between a clinically trained scientist, a biologically trained scientist, a physically trained scientist. And it's no good just mixing them up together and expecting it to work without effort. And I think this is a serious block in the way that we've done things. We've just, I was brought up, oh, well, let's put a clinical doctor into the laboratory and they have to do mini preps and stuff, things like that. Complete waste of their brain. But anyway, that's what we would, that's the sort of thing that we would say. Actually, we need to have seminars on how to talk to each other and how to understand we're trained. Because let's just take the clinician and the lab scientist. A lab scientist is trained in a different sort of way. They're trained that they don't actually have to make a decision, really, at that time. They do experiments. If they don't understand it, they'll do more experiments. If they don't understand it, they'll do more experiments. They don't work in a strong hierarchical structure, so they tend to be more anarchic. They don't have the same quite respect for professors and so on, because they don't need it, okay? And it's all, and they can be fairly misanthropic. They can look at their feet all the time and it doesn't matter. Look at a clinical scientist and it's really quite different. They have to make decisions. You don't want to go to a doctor and they say, well, that's interesting, but I wouldn't mind following your serum for the next 6 months so I can decide what to do when something really hurts. They have to make a decision based on limited evidence to do the best they can for you. They work in a hierarchy so they don't kill you, You don't want to go to me to be treaty for anything, But the point, you see the point I'm making, we're trained utterly differently. Then you mix us together and we're rubbing each other all the wrong way. The good places are to recognize the cultural differences, recognize the strengths and the reasons for it, and the strengths both sides have, and make them work well together. And I don't think we concentrate enough on that. I'm happy to take more questions if you want. It's entirely up to you.
I'm looking at Fiona, because you... Yeah.
I'm okay with it. It's entirely, you're in control.
Are you okay? I know you've got time schedules and so on.
I'm sorry. Thanks so much.
Okay, because I know lots of you have that.
Bye-bye, 63.
If you're happy, Paul, we could...
I can go on for as long as you like.
There's one here. You've been wanting to go for ages now.
I was wondering if you could comment on the participation of women in science, and particularly the low levels in senior management positions.
In which position?
Like sort of senior positions.
Senior positions, yes. This is one of the great issues of our time, really, because we constantly waste or do not exploit sufficiently 50% of the intellectual capital of humankind. Now, this is something we have to do something about, because it's not good for the individuals, for the women, and it isn't good for science, okay? So, really important issue. Now, we have come some way in dealing with this. When I was a student, I would say it was a significantly greater problem than today with you as a student. I mean, there really has been a change since the 1960s. And it is only the most unreconstructed individuals that would still make an argument that was commonplace in the 60s, 50s and 40s, that women couldn't do science as well as men. In my lab, I've always aimed at trying to have roughly 50-50 male-female, because they're not the same, They do contribute in different sorts of ways, but it's really complementary, you know. And I found that our whole activity has prospered by having this variety of approaches that happens. Now, since I've taken more leadership roles, I mean, I've had to worry a lot more about this. I mean, the Royal Society, of which I am president, elects 12–15% women each year, okay? And obviously 88% men. That reflects roughly the percentage of senior female academics in the sciences, particularly the physical sciences. So we only reflect what's there, but it tells you what a miserable state that we're in. If we now look at the overall composition of the Royal Society, it's down to less than 5%, because unfortunately you can only leave the Royal Society when you die. So as a consequence of that, it takes quite a long time to readjust the you know, the balance. Now, my council of elected fellows is in fact nearly 50% women, 50. So you can do something at that sort of level, but it is very, very difficult, and you tend to overwork the women actually, because they all want it. Now, what's the problem? Well, I think the cultural one is almost solved, not completely. I think now it is recognised across the disciplines that there is an issue here, it isn't justified, and we have to do something about it. So that's a plus, right? Now, let's now poke around and try and find out what the issues are. First issue at school. Certain scientific subjects are seen not to be for girls. Biology, biomedicine type subjects, okay. And in fact, now we're having a problem that we're getting so many women graduate students in our applicants. It's now, with my institute, we had 1,400 applicants for 40 places for graduate students last year for the Francis Crick, and we're ending up with 75% women, okay? And so now I've got to start thinking about, have we got to shift it the other way, okay? So, but that's the biological sciences. If we go into physics, particularly the more mathematically inclined physics, the percentages are low, so they're down at 10, 12, 15%. I mentioned my daughter, who's a high energy physicist at CERN, and when I visit her, she's the one woman in a sea of men, you know? I mean, it's just very, very unusual. So we have a problem at schools with certain subjects, not all subjects, but with certain subjects. How do we deal with that? Almost certainly by appropriate role models and by good teaching. Then let's talk about research. Once we get into the undergraduate, postgraduate, early career and so on, there is a constant attrition. So let's take biological sciences, which are better than the physical sciences. For certain, we'll be over 50% at the graduate level, and it will gradually drop down to 10 to 15% at senior academic. The big attrition is over childbearing age. And you know, sometimes I get attacked for saying it because as if I'm not quite politically correct in saying it. But actually, realistically, for me, that is the main thing that we have to deal with. There is a period of time, you know, between, say, age 30 and 40, when a professional woman researcher will be distracted, let's call it that, by having young children, okay? Now, we can go on as much as we like about sharing with men and all of that, and I know that's the politically correct thing to say, and that's why I get attacked when sometimes when I talk about this. But the pressure, I'm not here, I can't change all of society, you know? What I can try and deal with is the workplace for women scientists. So, I'd like to suggest, and we're going to run this as a pilot at the Francis Crick, I think that if we can support women through that 10-year period, then we can pull them back full-time into science from 40 onwards. That's my, or 40-ish onwards. And that's my, so I think what we should focus on is how can we support women during this phase when they are vulnerable, because that's where I think we lose them. And one way is, of course, is to genuinely have part-time appointments. When I mean genuinely, what can happen here is you can say, right, you work half-time, then everybody expects you to do full-time work in half-time. And that's not what I'm talking about. In a research institute environment, perhaps more difficult in a university, I think we can set something up where a woman between 30 and 40 could perhaps run a group of 2 or 3 people, as against 6, 7, and they could do it satisfactorily, okay? Because I think that is possible for them working 2.5 days a week or something of that sort. They could run it. They keep themselves in the game. They keep their name there. It may be a lower activity than they would ideally like, but when they come out the other end, they can pick up again. Now, that means society has to judge their performance based on half-time work. That cannot be a difficult thing for us to do. Just cannot be a difficult thing for us to do. So I'm going to create a position, a type of position, that, which can be used by men or women, of course, naturally, but it will be mainly aimed at women, I'm sure, which will allow that sort of activity. It's the only thing I can offer at the moment.
That's fine. We're going to have to stop, I'm afraid, because there are a variety of reasons we have to stop. So I understand that several student representatives from the MD Student Conference would like to thank Sir Paul and say a few words on behalf of the audience.
So, while I'm on my way down, my name's Daniel Saita, this is Kasun Wikaramarachi and Kimberly Chan, otherwise known as 19, 18 and 20. Yep. So we represent the MD Student Conference, and for background, it's a brand new initiative based at the Melbourne Medical School where we actually run as students a 4-day conference where we have all 1,400 medical students come and discuss issues. And our guiding principles are things like inspiring and educating students so they are able to passionately educate, research, and kind of continue on through advocacy and start changing the medical and health profession that way. And it's scientists like yourself that are so inspirational for us that we can say, look at Paul Nurse, look at what he's done in not only the field of like cancer research and cell molecular biology, but in advocacy, in changing health policy and to getting us where we are. And so that's why, on behalf of the Melbourne medical students, we would like to give you a present. Actually, on behalf of all the university students here, thank you very much, Sir Paul, and thank you for taking the time to come talk to us.
Thank you, that's very kind of you.
Oh, not a problem.
Thank you. I'm excited. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.